Okay, so back to this class. It's been 2 weeks since we've been here. I'm not going to do like a super thorough review, but we are going to go back to the introduction of the canon, which we introduced here well, let's see. Let's bring them all up. All right, so we have these four canon lists, and these were the canon lists that I said were Christian canon lists based on their confirmation of their affirmation of the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, the early Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, that these four denominations, if you will, these four divisions would have all affirmed those two creeds, and therefore both internally and externally would have been viewed as Christian historically. And so we first talked about the Protestant canon list, and the Protestant canon list has 39 books. And then we talked about the Roman Church canon list, which has 7 more books, but I see a 51 up there. And the 51 up there is just to tell you that that's the extra amount of writings. Some of those writings are in the books that already exist. And so you wouldn't necessarily see that if you were just to say that there were 7 extra books. And then you have the Eastern Orthodox that's got 3 more writings, and then you've got the Ethiopian that's got 60 plus 35. And so let's bring up the comparison, so it's easier to see what is different between the particular lists. So the Protestant list is going to be our baseline, obviously because I am a Protestant, but also because it is the canon list that is accepted by all sects of Christianity, whether it's the Roman Church, the Eastern Orthodox, or the Ethiopian Orthodox. We all agree on the Protestant canon list. It's the additional books after that, whether or not we agree on those. And so I highlighted in yellow. The highlighted ones in the yellow are added books from the ones that are from the list that's to the left of it. Okay, and then the more pinkish ones are a repeat of the books that were added to the left of it, and the yellow ones are new ones. Okay, if that makes sense. So I'll bring up my laser pointer here. So all these yellow ones here are added to this list. These yellow ones here are added to this list, but these pink ones are repeats of the ones that were already here. So we got these pink ones that are added from this one, and we got new yellow ones here. Okay. All right. And so we went through them. For example, Prayer of Menashe is not its own book. It's not its own book. You'll find that in 2nd Chronicles in the Catholic Bibles. Okay. Tobit and Judith are their own books. Oh man, and I totally blew this last week. I was talking about Ezra over and over again, and I kept pointing to Esther. I don't know if anyone else picked up on that, but my wife afterwards told me, she's like, you kept pointing at Esther when you were talking about Ezra. And I was like, oh yeah. And so I rewatched the video, and sure enough, I was like, yep, that's exactly what I did. I'm like, I don't know how many people I confused, but it would have been confusing. So yes, Esther has a, and I think why I did it is, and I never fixed it, was because I didn't highlight this one in pink, and that probably would have tipped me off that this should have been in pink. So anyway, we have Esther in Greek, which is an additional set of verses throughout the book of Esther. And then we have Wisdom and Ecclesiasticus, and then the Epistle of Jeremiah and Baruch. These would all be part of Jeremiah. Then we got Bel and the Dragon, Prayer of Azariah, and the Song of the 3 Young Men, which would all be part of Daniel. And then you've got 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Then we go to the Eastern Orthodox tradition. We've got 1st Ezra and 2nd Esdras. And so 1st Esdras is Ezra and Ezra. And 2nd Esdras, we'll talk about this as well. Nehemiah is also sometimes called 2nd Ezra or 2nd Ezra. So this gets really confusing because this 2nd Ezra, Nehemiah, is not this 2nd Ezra because they have Nehemiah. So this is a different book altogether. And then we have the 151st Psalm that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church affirms, that no one else affirms, not even the Ethiopian Orthodox affirms that one. So that's unique to their canon list. And then you get 3rd and 4th Maccabees as well. You'll get books that are titled the same way, titled differently, but are the same books. So First Kingdoms, Second Kingdoms, Third Kingdoms, Fourth Kingdoms is First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings. So that's the same overlap, just a different title. Same thing with Wisdom and Sirach. Sirach and Ecclesiasticus are the same books. Let's see, there are other ones with different names. Okay, then we get the Jubilees and Enoch in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. All right, those are 2 additional books that are only found in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon. And then you get Second Ezra, Third Esdras, and Fourth Esdras, and there is some overlap. I was still studying this week because it's still super confusing. In fact, I found an article that was entitled exactly what I needed to be titled, and it was called Disentangling the Books of Ezra. And I was like, oh, please help me with this. So there is some overlap. They are not entirely the same books, but a lot of this material can be found in both Second Esdras and so on. But today we're going to find some new stuff about Ezra that about these books that also helped give me some clarity when I was disentangling these books, because they are a mess. And then you've got the rest of Baruch. And then I don't think I mentioned this last week. Somehow I think I failed to talk about this, but we've got the book of Josephus, son of Bergorium. Okay, so that is not Josephus, the Jewish historian. It's not the same guy. It is about a Jewish man. It's a fictional story about a Jewish man named Josephus, or a Jewish boy named Josephus, but it has nothing to do with Josephus, the historian. Just like if you go to Sirach, all right, Sirach is going to be, I think the Eastern Orthodox is the full title. I didn't put the full title up there, but I think it's Joshua, the son of Sirach, or Joshua ben Sirach is the actual title. But in the Ethiopian Orthodox, it's Jesus ben Sirach. Same name, same book. It's just Joshua versus Jesus. You see the same thing happen in the New Testament. But it's not the Jesus it's just a man by the name of Jesus. It's not the Jesus of Nazareth, our Messiah. So there's that. So that was kind of an overview of our canon list. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about why this is even important, why we're talking about canon lists, and how we even got to this situation. And really, it was the Council of Trent in April 8th, 1546, where I'm not going to reread the whole thing, but this is their canon list listed here, okay? And you'll get different names, but for the same books, all right? So just as a review, the 4 books of the Kings, we already talked about that. It's the same in the Eastern Orthodox. It's First Samuel, Second Samuel, First Kings, Second Kings. You get 2 of Paralipomenon. I always mess it up. Anyway, that's Chronicles. And then the first book of Esdras, and the second, which is entitled Nehemiah. And then you get Tobias, Judith, Esther, Job, the Divinical Psalter containing 150 Psalms, not 151 as a knock against the Eastern Orthodox. Canticle of Canticles is Song of Songs. And then Jeremiah with Baruch, Ezekiel, Daniel, 12 minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos. Abdias is Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk. This Sophonius is Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and 2 books of Maccabees, the first and second. All right. And so that's where they list their canon list, where they list the canon. And then, which is fine. I think it's fine for any church to list the canon that they're going to use in that church. I think that's totally normal. We're going to see that throughout church history. But what they did at the Council of Trent, which was unprecedented in church history, is they anathematized anyone who did not agree with their canon. And so they went through and they basically said, if you don't agree with our canon, and everything that we say is in each of those books, so not just the book of Esther, but also the Greek portion of Esther, not just the book of Daniel, but all of the inserts that we have in the book of Daniel. If you don't affirm the same canon and what's in them, as we've described them, then you're anathematized. And I brought up the OED last week just to define the word anathema. And the reason why I do this is because when I talk to Catholics today, many of them have a different view of what it means to be anathematized than what the Council of Trent had in mind when the Council of Trent said we were anathematized. They're like, it just means we're rebuking you. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. It means we're going to hell. This is a far stronger statement in the Council of Trent than you're claiming it to be, and which is why I think it's important to go back to the original definition, which was excommunicated or assigned to damnation, because during the Reformation, you'll hear the phrase, or you'll read the phrase, no salvation outside the church. You had to be in the church to have salvation, particularly within the Roman Catholic Church. If you weren't in the Roman Catholic Church, then there is no salvation for you. So excommunication from the Roman Catholic Church is equivalent to assigned to damnation. Okay, so if we don't affirm the same canon list that they affirm, then we're anathematized. We're on our way to hell. And that is what causes Protestants to have to answer this objection. The Eastern Orthodox and the Ethiopian Orthodox, I have not studied up on if they responded, but I do know that their current positions today are, I don't know if I had a wording that was probably, I almost said open. They don't have an open canon. What they have is I don't know. I wish I had bolded it or something so that I would have seen it in my notes that much quicker. Flexible. There it is. They have a flexible canon, not open, but flexible. What that means is the Eastern Orthodox and the Ethiopian Orthodox canon is essentially what they say about their canon is our canon can be all of these books and nothing more, or maybe less. So we're not going to add to our canon list, but it might be that we're canonizing books that aren't actually canon. So we're willing to shrink our canon, but we're not willing to expand our canon. So that's their position. So they have when I initially started to write this, and I was talking to some Eastern Orthodox people on Facebook because I wanted to make sure I was representing their view correctly, I used the word open. They're like, no, we don't have an open canon. And so I was looking for a better word. I said flexible. Is flexible a better word? And he seemed to be okay with that one. That they were willing to they weren't willing to dogmatize their canon like the Catholic Church did, or what we do with our, even in Protestantism, but they were willing to say it's possible we have more books in our canon than are actually canon. We're willing to concede that point. So the reason why that is the case is because the Eastern Orthodox churches have their own divisions within them, that some say certain books that they have are not actually in the canon, and others say, yes, they're in the canon, but we're not willing to divide over this issue. So we'll let you say that you have fewer books in the canon than we do. This is okay. So this is fine within the Eastern Orthodox and the Ethiopian Orthodox as well. When I was working through these lists, that was part of the problem I was having, is I was trying to figure out what's in the canon, and I would find various canon lists, and I would realize they didn't agree. And I'm pulling them from actual churches, where they would list them. And I'm like, hey, you're missing this book. Oh, you're missing that book. And I would look into it and, okay, that book is in disagreement. They disagree in that denomination over that canon. So I'm giving you the largest canon list I could find. So I'm giving you all the books possible, and then there might be some within Eastern Orthodox or some within Ethiopian Orthodox who would say, well, no, actually, we don't affirm all of those. So this is the largest list possible with some variation that it might be smaller. And so Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, and Ethiopian Orthodox are anathematized per the Roman Church. Right? We're all on our way to hell because we don't affirm the exact canon list of the Roman Church. And the question then becomes, how did we get there? How did the Council of Trent get there? What was going on? And so before we get to the Council of Trent, we go to the Leipzig Disputation of 1519. And this is actually a really interesting situation where we have Martin Luther on the left there and Cardinal Johann Meyer von Eck, and I'm just going to call him Eck from this point forward. He's a Catholic theologian, and they are having a debate. They're having a debate over praying to saints and purgatory. These are two things that they were really debating over. And Luther and Eck are clashing over this. And Luther, and as they're clashing, Eck quotes 2 Maccabees as a proof text for praying to the saints. And Luther concedes. He says, yes, 2 Maccabees does seem to, in this passage, seem to affirm praying to saints. But then he says, in all of Scripture, there is no recollection of purgatory, because these two arguments were happening at the same time. No recollection of purgatory, because the book of Maccabees, since it is not in the canon, is effective only for the faithful, but will not succeed against the stubborn. So Luther being the stubborn. So so what he was saying was, it's not canon, it's not scriptures, therefore we can't determine doctrine off of 2 Maccabees. Well, Eck returned that he acknowledged that the book of Maccabees were not among the Hebrew canon, but they were in fact among the Christian canon. And so he raises that Augustine affirmed the book of Maccabees. And you can find that in City of God, 1836, chapter 18, verse 36. So then Luther and Eck, they just began to stack authorities against each other. Well, this guy said this. Well, this guy said this. And we'll talk about those authorities in a minute. In his assessment, Luther, so Eck raises Augustine. Now, Augustine is a pretty monumental giant within church history. So this is a great amount of weight that Augustine affirms the book of 2 Maccabees. So Luther raises his own church giant, and he raises Jerome. And he says Jerome did not affirm the book of 2 Maccabees. And so those two guys were also contemporary with each other, and they had these debates back in those days. So if we were to turn to the 1534 German Luther Bible, the section in the middle, you've got the Apocrypha, that is the books not considered equal to Holy Scripture, but are useful and good to read. Now, I want you to remember that are useful and good to read. So they put the Apocrypha in the middle, like these are helpful books, but they're not Scripture. Someone asked me last week if I was going to get to the term Apocrypha, and I'm not ready to get to it, but I'm just give you a summary, where it came from and what it meant. It is Jerome who actually calls these books for the first time apocryphal. And the word apocryphal just meant hidden. They meant hidden because they didn't know what the source language was. It wasn't Hebrew, or they didn't have anything that suggested that it was Hebrew. So it seemed like it came from the Greek or something else. And so Jerome said, because these aren't, and I'm getting ahead of myself as part as to why we determine the canon, but the question was asked, and I'm still not addressing it, and I'm afraid they're going to get asked again. I don't remember who asked it, so if you're in here, I'm sorry. I'm not picking on you. I just remembered just now that you asked the question. It's because I have to work my way back through church history to get to Jerome to understand why we have these apocryphal books. But it is Jerome that calls them apocryphal. And because it's Jerome that calls them apocryphal, everyone else calls them apocryphal. The Roman Church, however, while they still use the word apocryphal because everyone else does, it's not the term they prefer. They prefer deuterocanonical, second canon. And so that's that. So you have Eck and Luther going back and forth, raising authorities against each other. But as you read through their debate, as they go back and forth, you start seeing that the question is getting framed interestingly. And I thought this was probably the best way to help understand how they were framing the debate. So how did they frame the debate? Well, from the Protestant view, the canon is a list of authoritative books. It's a list of authoritative books. While the Roman Church believed it is an authoritative list of books. That's the real clash here. Is the list authoritative or are the books authoritative? Okay. And so as you read, this nuance becomes really important to understanding the debate. from the Protestant and the Luther side, it's the books that are authoritative, and the list is just listing authoritative books. And on the Roman side, they are saying, no, 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 we determine what is authoritative by putting it in the list. And that is the real debate. So who decides what's authoritative? What is the standard? Who determines what the canon is? And so that becomes part of it. And so they began to debate how they determine what goes on the list. All right. And so again, the Protestant side is saying, well, how we're going to determine it is by looking at what the church has received through church history. What have we historically received? And what did the Jewish people receive as scripture? On the Roman side, they said that which has been defined throughout church history and what is edifying to the church. So remember, good and useful becomes now a criteria for whether or not it should be canon. Protestants agreed historically that the Apocrypha was good and useful, but they did not believe it was canon. To kind of give you some ideas behind that, I think Pilgrim's Progress is good and useful, but I don't think it's canon. I think the works of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and things of that nature are good and useful. I don't think they're canon. I think the history of Eusebius, the church history of Eusebius, is good and useful, but I don't think it's canon. So just because things are good and useful and help the church, I don't believe that necessarily makes it canon. The Catholic Church or the Roman Church would disagree with me on this point concerning particular books, particularly the books in the Apocrypha. But I do want to say this, that becomes the Protestant standard. Luther himself had a different standard. Luther did not have the same view of scripture that the rest of the Protestants had. And so I want to say this because we need to acknowledge some of the stuff that he does. So Luther himself, he had his canon list required that the books must clearly present the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ through faith, and that any book that didn't would be secondary. This is going to become more important when we start dealing with the New Testament canon, but it also affected Luther's Old Testament canon. And I want to say this because this is a transition Luther makes later in his life. Early in his life, he had the same Protestant canon as all the other Protestants. Later in his life, he began to question certain books. Actually, I shouldn't. I'm regarding the Old Testament. The New Testament, he had questions about certain books right from the get-go. So we'll get to that. But I'm saying this because the Reformation as a whole didn't just follow what Luther's own issues were. Luther was struggling to accept certain books. The Protestant Reformation as a whole was not struggling. Luther was struggling. And so I want to make that distinction because this is going to be a point of contention later. So with regard to the Old Testament, what books did Luther struggle with? So what I'm going to do is, this is the canon list. What I'm going to do is the next slide, I'll highlight in green all of the books that Luther began to struggle with. And so the book that he struggled with was the book of Esther. Just the book of Esther regarding the Old Testament. Now, early, if you go to the German Luther Bible, again, and you go to the book of Esther and you go to, they're called arguments back then. So we call them like prologues, where you have an introduction to each book. Tyndale, Luther, and a number of other guys, their prologue was called the argument. The argument. Basically, what's this book dealing with? If you go to Luther's argument in Esther, he has high praise for Esther. She thinks she's a wonderful woman, exemplary in honor, high praise. But later in his life, you start reading his writings, he changes his view. He refers to the book of Esther as pagan and heathen. He no longer appreciates the book of Esther. And there's a lot of reasons why some people suggest that Luther changed his view on the book of Esther. Some suggest that his view on the book of Esther changed partially because his view of Jews had changed. He had become very, in my opinion, sinfully antagonistic towards Jewish people. So that might be part of it. The other part, maybe the part that really instigated it, is the fact that within the Hebrew book of Esther, not the Septuagint book of Esther, but within the Hebrew book of Esther, there is no mention of God anywhere. like God's name isn't mentioned. So between the fact that there is no mention of God and Luther's view of Jews has shockingly declined, those might be two reasons why he started to question the book of Esther. Here's the problem, though, for the Catholics when it comes to this. They like to say, this is their argument, I hear it all the time, Luther removed the books of the Bible, removed 7 books of the Bible. It was Luther's doing. It happened at the Reformation. Luther did it, and all the Protestants followed. It couldn't be further from the truth, had nothing to do with Luther. And if the Protestants were blindly following Luther, we wouldn't have Esther in our Bible either. We didn't blindly follow Luther. Luther was not highly influential on the canon, though he was bringing the debate to the forefront. So while I appreciate Luther's views on canon and things of that nature, and he had a lot of good theology and stuff that I would like to dig into, we don't blindly follow Luther. He's not the Protestant Pope. So we can disagree with him. And everyone in Christendom disagrees with him on the book of Esther. And that's okay. Okay. So that's that. So we don't follow his criteria for canon, nor do we follow his where he came to at the end of his life for the canon. However, the debate between him and Eck is still really important, and we need to understand it. So we'll go through some of the authorities that they listed against each other, that they weighed against each other. We already started with Augustine on the right and Jerome on the left. So those were two. The Protestants were pulling Jerome onto their side, and the Roman Church was pulling Augustine onto their side as far as the canon was concerned. As I read these debates, a lot of people wanted to pull in Origen and Eusebius, but neither of their particular canon lists exactly overlaps either of the Roman Church or the Protestant Church. It was slightly different, not entirely different, but slightly different. So you can't really pull either of those guys into either camp because neither of them held something identical. So who do we have? We have Augustine on the left, and then, Jerome on the left, and then Luther brought in Roman Cardinal Ximenes and Roman Cardinal Tommaso Cajetan and Desiderius Erasmus. Those were the men that Luther pulled onto his side and said, hey, what Luther was doing here, which I love, it's a great debate tactic, is he was taking co-workers, if you will, people on X side. These are men on your side. They are Catholics just like you, or Roman Catholics just like you. And he's pulling them and saying, they don't agree with you. Your own compadres don't agree with you. So he pulls in Tommaso Cajetan. I want to read what Cajetan had to say. He writes an argument against Luther in 1518, but then he states that all authentic historical books in Old Testament and Job. At the end of his comments on Esther, Cajetan wrote a long note explaining that he did not comment. Okay, so he's writing a commentary. He's writing a commentary, and he doesn't give commentary on Tobit, Judith, or 1st and 2nd Maccabees because these books were not listed among the canonical books. So he says, hey, I've written notes in all of the canonical books, but I didn't write in those ones because they're not canon, they're secondary. And then Desiderius Erasmus, he says, the spirit in which the church now holds the other books in public use, this is important too, in public use. This is going to be pivotal to understanding the canon. The spirit in which now the church holds the other books in public use, which the ancients by great consensus were numbering among the Apocrypha, is not sufficiently agreed upon. We will certainly include as what is worthy for a Christian, whatever ecclesiastical authority accepts. It is certainly of great importance what the church approves of and in what spirit. For even if we attribute equal authority to the volumes of Hebrews, this is the Hebrew canon, not the book of Hebrews, okay? To the volumes of the Hebrews and the 4 Gospels, that certainly does not mean the books of Judith, Tobit, and Wisdom have the same weight as the Pentateuch of Moses. So he goes on, he's saying, hey, these extra books, these apocryphal books, have not been sufficiently agreed upon throughout church history. There's always debate on these books. And even if we did accept them, they don't carry, no one will suggest that they carry the same weight as the books of Moses. So that was an interesting position. And so Eck, he fires back with his own set of authorities. He doesn't leave it at Augustine. He also goes to Pope Gelasius, Pope Eugenius, and the Council of Florence. Ultimately, those are all going to side with Eck's position of the canon. And that position on the canon will become what is affirmed at the Council of Trent. Okay, so when you get to these guys, these two popes and the Council at Florence, they are going to affirm, or the Council of Trent is going to affirm what these guys had already suggested was canon. Luther, as they're starting to stack the authorities against each other, Luther eventually goes to Scripture. Instead of just arguing one authority against another authority, he says, hey, we have actually Scripture that helps intervene in this matter. And so he goes to Romans 3, verses 1 and 2. He says, so what advantage does a Jew have? Or what is the benefit of circumcision? Considerable in every way, for they were entrusted with the very words of God. So the argument here is we need to look to the Jews. We need to see what the Jews affirmed as their canon before we look at what the church received as their canon. Now, the Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Church, they're going to rebut. Their rebuttal primarily will be the Jews rejected Christ. They are not an authority on the canon. And because they're not an authority of the canon and the church replaces Israel, then we get to decide what's in the canon. We don't have to look to the Jews. And that is not the Protestant view. It's like, wait a minute. No, they were entrusted with the words of God. They had the words of God. They had a canon of the words of God, and we shouldn't add to it or subtract from it. We should accept what they accepted. So also because the continuation of that argument, which we're not there yet, but the continuation of that argument is the New Testament was written by the same Jews, and we're affirming that canon as well. So there's that. So, okay. So that goes back to this list. So we have, what is it that we're arguing over? Are we arguing over a list of authoritative books, or are we arguing over a authoritative list of books? And so we need to go back. I think it's important to go back and try the best as we can to figure out what was it that the Jews did affirm as their canon? What was their canon list? Well, a good place to go, the place most people go to, is going to be Flavius Joseph, sorry. And so he writes this in his Against Appian, book 1, chapter 8, 38 through 42. So he says, for we have not innumerable multiple books among us. Okay, so just so you're aware, Appian is a Greek philosopher, and some suggest he might have been made up, like he's a made up character, so Josephus can argue against the views that these Greek philosophers had. Some suggest he was a real guy and he was actually debating with him. In either case, he's dealing with particularly Greek people who are arguing against Judaism and Jews in general. Okay, so he's defending Judaism, not Christianity, and he's not attacking Christians either. Christians aren't in view in this. So he says, for we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another as the Greeks have, but only 22 books which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine, and of them 5 books of Moses, which contain the laws and traditions of the origin of mankind until his death. This interval of time was a little short of 3,000 years. But as to the time from the death of Moses to the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, who reigned after Xerxes, the prophet, who were after Moses, wrote down what was done in their times in 13 books. The remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and precepts for the conduct of human life. So here, Josephus is saying this is our canon. We have 22 books, okay? 5 of them are Moses's books. 13 of them are from the prophets, and 4 of them are additional writings that would inform us as to precepts and conduct for human life. And he gives a timeline. It's what was written from Moses to Artaxerxes. From Moses to Artaxerxes. Well, when did Artaxerxes reign? This is actually a really important question, and it circles us back a little bit to where I started. Artaxerxes was contemporary with Ezra and Nehemiah. So he says, hey, among the Jews, we go from Moses to Ezra and Nehemiah, not after that. Now, interestingly enough, if you guys are familiar with world history, this is small rabbit trail, Artaxerxes is the son of Xerxes the First. Xerxes the First is the husband of Esther. So when you read about Ahasuerus in the book of Esther, you're reading about Xerxes. And if you want to do further world history, if any of you are familiar with the Battle of Thermopylae, where the Persian king attacks the 300 Spartans, and you got the 300 Spartans who make that stand, makes world history. We still study it today. It's a fascinating story. That is Xerxes. That's Esther's husband. Esther's husband is the one who leads that charge, which is fascinating. If you read Esther's, I think it's chapters 1 and 2, or at least chapter 1, you'll see Vashti, Queen Vashti, as being a problem for Ahasuerus because she's not showing up to the party. The scholars that understand this, that party was the recruitment party to go after the Spartans. They were bringing in all the kings, and this was to get them on board to go for this battle, to help back him, to finance him, to supply troops. And if you study what happened at Thermopylae, there was all sorts of troops from all over the empire that showed up to that fight. And that was the recruitment party, and Vashti doesn't show up. She gets expelled from the kingdom for not showing up to that party. So anyway, interesting overlap there. Artaxerxes is his son. That's who's contemporary with Ezra and Nehemiah. So that was important. That's why one of the reasons why I wanted to establish Ezra early on was so that this would help you make this connection here. However, Josephus has more to say about the canon. And so we'll continue. Most people just stop with this part, but I think what he says next is also super important. I don't know why a few of the sources that I read didn't include this. It is true, our history hath been written since Artaxerxes very particularly, but hath not been esteemed of the like authority with the former by our forefathers, because there hath not been an exact succession of prophets since that time. And how firmly we have given credit to those books of our own nation is evident by what we do. For during so many ages have already passed, no one has been so bold as to add anything to them, to take anything from them, or to make any change in them. But it becomes natural to all Jews immediately and from their very birth to esteem those books to contain divine doctrines and to persist in them, and if occasion be, willingly die for them. So Josephus goes on to say, yes, we do have more writings that occur after Artaxerxes, and they're good writings, but they're not what the books of Moses are. They're not the canon. They're addition. So, and then he says, no one has been so presumptuous as to add those books to our canon. So he's making it clear that we've got a distinction here. We've got the canon and we've got an apocryphal set. He doesn't call them apocryphal. That's not his word. That won't show up for another 300 years. He's writing in about 100 AD. And so that's important. So anything after Artaxerxes is not canon. So what is after Artaxerxes? Well, pretty much everything that's highlighted up there. Everything that's highlighted up there does not date before Artaxerxes. Okay. So that's very interesting. Now, maybe you were paying attention and you heard that Josephus said, we have 22 books, 5 books of Moses, and what did he say? 13 prophets, and then 4 other writings. but we have 39 books in our canon. And so let's see if we can do any overlap. Well, we have the 5 books of Moses. This we agree on. But then he says we have 13 prophets and 4 writings, equaling a total of 22 books. Where are those other books? He doesn't give the list. We don't know. I can speculate, and I'm going to later. I'm going to show you where the list comes in. But so many people will quote Josephus as though we know exactly what those books are, and it's not as simple as it actually, as many make it be. Yes, Josephus clearly had a canon in mind. I think if someone had pressed Josephus and said, Josephus, name the books, give us the names of the 22 books, he would have been able to rattle them off. He knew how many books there were, what sections they were categorized in, and the dating of them. He knew what they were. He just didn't tell us. He didn't, in his mind, it was obvious, at least. Most people knew what he was talking about. So we're going to keep doing some more work in this area. He doesn't name the 13 prophets. I already said that, so we'd have to speculate. So we're going to keep going. We're going to keep looking to see if we can get some more hints throughout church history. And we'll go to this next section before we end class. And I'm glad I at least got to this, because I just wanted to show you the amount of frustration that I have with the books of Ezra. So again, I am not the source of this. It's not like I just studied this all and I'm the one doing the work. I am repeating what's been taught to me. And all of these sources that I'm dealing with will also go to 4th Ezra. 4th Ezra, to quote this section. And so it says this in 4th Ezra. It says, and it came to pass when 40 days were fulfilled that the highest spake, saying, the first which thou hast written, publish openly, that the worthy and unworthy may read it, but keep the 70 last, that thou mayest deliver them only to such as be among the people. For in them is the spring of understanding, the fountain of wisdom, and the stream of knowledge. I think I missed the wise among the people. And I did so. And that's the KJV Apocrypha. But if you look at my cross-reference footnote there, it says 2nd Ezra. But if you look at my source at the top of the page, it says 4th Ezra. Because my source, the one I'm pulling this information from, says I found this quote in 4th Ezra. And I fact check everyone. Every time I read someone who says I have a source, I don't copy it from them. I go to the source, I find it. And I was really frustrated because I couldn't find 4th Ezra or 4th Ezra. I couldn't find it anywhere. And I spent $11 the other day thinking I had found a resource that was going to give me 4th Ezra. And I knew 4th Ezra was in the Ethiopian canon, right? Because it's the only one that has the 4th Ezra in it. I'm like, oh, it's in the Ethiopian canon? I just need to find a translation of the Ethiopian canon in English so that I can present this. And I couldn't find a good Coptic translation. They're really hard to come by. A reliable one at that. I found plenty, but I was like, I don't know about you. So, so I was hunting all around, only to find out as I began to do a search that the quote I was looking for was in the Apocrypha in the King James Bible, in that middle section. I was like, oh, I just wasted $11. I've had the Apocrypha all along. It's right here. Not just the Apocrypha, but this book, the 4th Ezra book. Because the 4th Ezra book is not part of the Catholic canon, the Roman Catholic canon, that I thought that it wouldn't be in the KJV canon, or not the KJV canon, the KJV Apocrypha, because I thought all the center books in the KJV Apocrypha were the equivalent writings to what the Roman Catholic Church affirmed. So I didn't realize that, oh, 2nd Ezra is in the KJV. So I went and pulled it up and I read it and I copied the verse down. I was like, okay, ready to go. But what you can't see, what I can see, what you can't see, because I haven't introduced it to you yet, is that this is not giving me what I was looking for. There's a specific phrase in this verse that's missing, that's in my source material. When the sources that I'm following quote this verse, they have a phrase in here that's not in my KJV verse. And so I was like, well, I have other more modern versions of the Apocrypha than the KJV one. So you guys may not know this, but the ESV has a Catholic edition. So I was like, I'll just pull out my ESV Catholic edition. Surely I'll find a more modern version of this and see if I can understand why this discrepancy exists. Well, that was foolish of me. I just told you that it's not affirmed in the Catholic canon. I pulled up the ESV Catholic Apocrypha, and I'm looking. I can't find 2nd Ezra anywhere or 4th Ezra anywhere because it's not in the Roman Catholic canon. So I wasted my time there. I was like, but I have the NRSV and the NRSVU. Surely they have it. So I opened it up, and sure enough, they have it. And they have the verse, and they have the phrase that was missing. And when the 40 days were ending, the Most High spoken to me, saying, make public the 24 books that you wrote first. And I was like, oh, there it is. It's in the NRSV. And so why is it missing from the KJV? And I realized that this is a textual variant, that in the Syriac and Arabic, older manuscripts have the phrase 24 books, but in the Latin manuscript, which the KJV translators were translating from to make their Apocrypha, did not have it. Why is this important? Why do we need to get to the 24 books? Because now we have 2 canon lists. We have 22 from Josephus and 24 from 4th Ezra, because this 24 that is being mentioned here is the Old Testament canon that we have. The 70 are other books, but remember, I'm over time, so I'm going to end this here. But remember that there's public reading that is necessary as part of the canon as well, and that these 70 books aren't part of the public reading. They're esoteric for particular Jews. But the canon was open for all people, for the wise and the unwise, or the worthy and the unworthy. All right, so I'm going to pause here. We'll pick this up next week, talking more about 4th, 2nd Ezra, okay? And continue the Jewish canon, try to get some hints as to a definitive list of the Jewish canon before we get to what Christians affirm. And that will be it for this week. Thank you.